Eleanor, it's urgent. My phone buzzed at 11:51 p.m. The sender, my mother. The subject line, studio. My stomach turned. I opened the email. Margaret Hayes wrote, Charles and I have decided to sell the studio to his investors. You'll need to sign papers to release your co-ownership from your father's will. This is for your future. Betrayal hit me before I even had time to breathe. Another email arrived seconds later, from a law firm I didn't recognize. On behalf of Charles Whitman, we are authorized to offer $10,000 for your immediate release of all claims. $10,000 for my father's lifetime of work. My heart didn't race. I didn't scream. I felt a cold clarity. This wasn't a family fight. It was attempted theft. At 12:03 a.m., 12 minutes after my mother's email, I called Daniel Reed, my father's oldest friend and our family lawyer. Straight to voicemail. I didn't hesitate. Daniel, it's Eleanor. Sorry for the hour, but it's happening. They're trying to sell the studio in breach of the will. Freeze everything. Activate the artisan clauses immediately. I'm on the first flight to Maine tomorrow. I booked the ticket from Chicago to Portland, then opened my encrypted files. They had forgotten one critical detail: they underestimated me. They thought I was the daughter who had left to build a career in the city. They forgot I was also the silent architect, the one who co-signed the expansion loan with my father when no bank would listen. They forgot I pored over contracts, drafted blueprints for the new wing, and slipped in the artisan clause, a legal safeguard ensuring the studio could only produce master-level custom work. No mass production. No cheap knockoffs. A protective measure for my father's art. They also forgot the last 3 years. After Dad passed, Margaret couldn't manage the finances. The studio was 2 months from a tax auction. I didn't call her. I didn't lecture her. I wired $12,000 from my Chicago account. Secretly, I had been paying the property taxes all along. That was just maintenance. What they really ignored was the $85,000 I had invested in structural restoration, immediately after Dad died, just before Charles entered our lives. Dad and I had called it the Foundation Project. The main workshop, built in the 1940s, was rotting from the sea air. Roof sagging. Support beams failing. Dad was a master craftsman, but not an engineer. I was. I flew home 3 weekends in a row, surveyed the structure, drafted plans, hired contractors, and paid every dollar. It wasn't charity. It was an investment in our shared legacy. I had even sent Margaret the invoices, thinking I was protecting her future. Naive. I thought I was protecting the studio from the world. Not from my own mother. By morning, my phone erupted. Margaret had called. I answered, calm, steady. Let's see how you handle the daughter who never left, I thought. If you love real emotional stories, hit subscribe, we post one every day. I was in a cab from the airport, the cold coastline rushing past the window. My phone vibrated. I answered. It wasn't a greeting, it was a shriek. Eleanor. What have you done? What did you do? Margaret's panic sliced through the line. Daniel froze the accounts. Charles's investors are furious. He's going to lose the deal. You're destroying everything. I kept my voice calm, even. I'm protecting what Dad built. What Dad built? Her scoff carried a note of desperation I'd never heard before. Dad is gone. Eleanor, this is about my future, my life. You have your fancy Chicago life. Why do you care? Before I could respond, another voice cut in, slurred and threatening. Eleanor, you think you're clever. At 9 a.m., showing up with your lawyer. That studio is mine. I've been running it. Running it into the ground. You mean? I said, My own tone shockingly cold. You'll regret this, he growled. Nothing for you. Hear me. Nothing. The line went dead. I sat frozen, phone humming in my hand. No anger. Only crystal clear precision. An hour later, my phone buzzed again, Facebook notification. My grandmother, Susan Hayes, had tagged me. The post, Margaret, publicly shaming me on the small town page. When children forget who raised them, when success makes them cold enough to try to steal their mother's future, pray for us. We are under attack from our own family. That was it. The last thread of obligation snapped. She had chosen him over me, over Dad's memory. I had my permission for total, uncompromising war. I flew into Portland and met Daniel Reed at his office. Daniel wasn't just a lawyer, he'd practically been my uncle, lifting me onto his shoulders at boatyard picnics. His face was serious, but his eyes were sharp. Eleanor, he said, sliding a thick document toward me, you were right to call. Smarter at 19 than most at 50. He pointed to a highlighted paragraph, the artisan clause. Property is exclusively for master-level custom craft. Any mass production or prefabricated goods is a material breach. Daniel leaned back. Charles Whitman isn't a craftsman. He's outsourcing cheap fiberglass pieces, selling them as authentic Hayes designs. This clause protects Dad's legacy. The injunction holds. It isn't a question, I said. Yes, but to win in court, we need proof of damage, not just breach, Daniel said. Then we audit, I said. My voice all architect, all precision, a legal, detailed audit. We drove to the workshop, my childhood home. For years since I'd been back. Not since Charles came into our lives. The house was neglected, trim peeling. The garden replaced by gravel. But the workshop made my blood run cold. Charles stood by the bay doors, beer in hand, smirking. The hero returns. Come see what real business looks like. I ignored him. Eyes scanning the room like a forensic investigation. Where is it? I asked quietly. Where's what? The lathe. Dad's workbench. The one from the salvaged mast. Charles gestured lazily to a pile of scrap. That old thing. Rotted. Made room for the new finishing station. He pointed to a cheap particle board table, varnish smeared. I pulled out my phone, not to cry, not to scream. Daniel, I said, voice clinical. Document everything. I began the audit. My father's hand-forged tools, the ones passed down from his father, were gone from the wall. In their place, cheap plastic-handled power tools. The pegboard where he'd carefully traced each outline in black marker stood empty. Overhead, the exposed oak beams I'd helped him sand and oil were buried under a thick, garish coat of gray paint. And in the main bay, where the half-finished hull of a custom schooner had sat for years, my father's unfinished masterpiece, it was gone. Instead, 3 identical fiberglass motorboat shells had been shoved into the space, the cheap kits Daniel had warned me about. The scent of sawdust and cedar had been replaced with toxic resin and chemical solvents. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate erasure. He's not just breaching the contract, I said to Daniel, loud enough for Charles to hear. I photographed the sloppy paint, the damaged flooring where Dad's workbench had been torn out. He's committing fraud. Stealing craft. Using my father's name, Hayes Boats, to sell this garbage. Charles's face flushed purple. You can't prove a thing. This is progress. We'll see, I said, turning to Daniel. Audit everything. I want to know where every one of Dad's original blueprints are, and every penny from the sale of his tools. I turned back to Charles. You should have taken the $10,000. I'd thought this fight was about the artisan clause, about a breach of contract. I was wrong. It was far worse. That evening, Daniel called my hotel. His calm, steady voice was gone, replaced with tension. Eleanor. I found it. This isn't just breach. It's criminal. I sank onto the bed. What do you mean? The $85,000 restoration fund, you wired it 4 years ago. It never reached the contractors. Charles intercepted it. I felt the air leave my lungs. He stole it. He did worse, Daniel said, his voice heavy with disgust. He convinced Margaret to pay the contractors herself, claiming it was a short-term cash flow issue. Meanwhile, he took your $85,000 and covered his own gambling debts. Then he mortgaged the cleared property again with a new $85,000 loan. But he can't do that, right? I'm co-owner. I never signed anything, I said, heart racing. He forged Margaret's signature. And the bank records show he tried to forge yours too. Two flagged the mismatch, which is why he had to use a private lender. But the intent is clear. This is fraud, forgery, larceny. The floor dropped out beneath me. This wasn't about fiberglass boats. This was a methodical plot to dismantle my family's legacy. How? I whispered. How could she let this happen? Daniel sighed. She wasn't blind, Eleanor. Margaret was trapped. That's the hardest part to understand. People assume stupidity, but it's something else, emotional dependency. When Robert died, he didn't just leave a husband. He left validation, a sense of self. Then Charles arrived, charming, attentive. By the time the lies and drinking started, she was too deep in. Fear of being alone outweighed fear of him. He isolated her, convinced her family didn't care, convinced her you didn't care. She became a willing victim, co-signing her own destruction for companionship. I understood. But understanding didn't mean forgiving. He didn't just steal from a bank, I said to Daniel, the cold clarity returning. He preyed on a grieving widow. He targeted my family. Eleanor, what exactly do you want me to do? File everything, I said, voice steady. The breach of contract, civil damages, the criminal complaint for fraud and forgery. Send it all to the district attorney. No more negotiations. The war had shifted. The final confrontation was set. Daniel, the local sheriff, Robert Hayes's lifelong friend, was with me as we pulled up to the workshop. Just as he predicted, Margaret and Charles weren't packing, they were moving, trying to load equipment and 2 fiberglass boat kits onto a flatbed before the full injunction could take effect. They were liquidating assets. Charles spotted us first. His face, flushed from drinking, went a dark blotchy purple. You can't be here, he screamed, pointing at me. This is my property. My investors are waiting. This is not your property, I said, voice low, unwavering. I stepped from the car, holding a single folder. The sheriff stood beside me, hand calmly resting on his belt. I have a deal, Charles shouted, advancing toward me. It was never your business, I said, raising the folder. I let him see the highlighted words. The artisan clause, the one Dad and I had written, violated the second he brought cheap fiberglass garbage into the workshop. The injunction was absolute. Breach had been ongoing for 3 years. Charles's eyes darted to the sheriff, then back to me, cornered like an animal. Before he could move, Margaret ran from the house, face streaked with tears and panic. She grabbed my arm. Eleanor, no. Please, don't do this. We'll lose everything, she cried, voice cracking. The house, the workshop, will have nothing. Charles is trying to build us a future. This, I said, gesturing to the cheap fiberglass shells, is not a future. It's a desecration. If you ever loved me, do this for me. For your mother, she begged, clutching my jacket. The air went still. I looked into her eyes. For the first time, I didn't see my mother. I saw a stranger. "I'm not doing this for you, Margaret," I said, voice cutting through her sobs. "I'm doing this for Dad." I freed my arm, turning to the sheriff and handing him the thick binder I carried. "This is the court injunction," I said. "And this," tapping another binder, "is the criminal complaint, evidence of bank fraud, forgery, and theft of the $85,000 restoration loan." Margaret's face went white. Charles just stared. Understanding came too late. The sheriff read the first page, then looked at Charles. "Charles Whitman, you are under arrest for fraud and forgery." Charles exploded, raging, cursing me, Margaret, the sheriff, calling me every insult imaginable. He threatened, "You'll get nothing. I'll burn it all down before I let you have it." The sheriff pushed him into the back of the cruiser. Margaret collapsed to the gravel driveway, sobbing, broken and empty. I didn't look at her. I looked past her, into the workshop. The floor where Dad's workbench had stood for decades, oil stains, bolt holes, the place where he taught me to honor the wood grain, was empty. His legacy ripped out and sold for scrap. I exhaled. "Goodbye, Margaret." Then I got in my car and drove away, leaving them in the ruins. Charles was convicted on all counts: forgery, larceny, stolen craft. His careful narrative in town crumbled overnight. The local paper ran the story: the con man who tried to steal the Hayes Boatyard legacy. He was sentenced to 7 years in state prison. Margaret wasn't charged. Daniel and I had debated it, but the DA recognized her as a victim of emotional and financial manipulation. She was broken. With Charles gone, the fog of dependency finally lifted. Replaced by a crushing shame, she moved in with my aunt. For the first time, she began therapy. Our relationship isn't healed. I don't know if it ever will be. But it's stable. I stayed in Maine for the next month, not in the house, but in the workshop. The smell of resin and chemical paint was overwhelming. I hired a crew, and we started the purge. Particle board tables were torn out. Gray paint stripped from oak beams. Floors scrubbed, trying to remove the residue of his cheap assembly. On the last day, while sweeping a pile of debris from under the main floorboards, my broom struck something solid. A loose plank. My heart raced. I grabbed a crowbar and gently pried it up. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, nestled in a small, custom recess in the foundation, was my father's tool roll, his hand-forged chisels, custom mallets, and the marking gauge of brass and rosewood. The tools Charles had claimed were worthless junk. He hadn't sold them, he simply hadn't been clever enough to find them. I sat on the dusty floor, holding the cold steel, and finally let myself cry. I looked around the empty, clean workshop and thought of the 11 years I'd spent in Chicago. For so long, I'd carried a sharp, heavy guilt. I told myself I'd abandoned my family, that I was the cold daughter who ran. But holding Dad's legacy in my hands, I realized the truth: loyalty isn't always absolute. Leaving isn't always betrayal. Sometimes it's survival. I had to leave. I had to go to Chicago. I had to forge myself into someone strong enough to return. To build armor, wealth, skill, and resilience so that when the time came, I could fight the war they declared on me. My absence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. I stood and walked to the one surviving workbench, the drafting table my father and I had built together. I unrolled his original blueprints for the schooner he never completed. The ink was crisp, lines precise. Next to them, I unrolled my own, designed in my mind for over a decade. The title block read, "The Robert Hayes Institute of Artisan Craft." The workshop was no longer a tomb. It was a foundation. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated, hit like and subscribe. But more than that, I want to hear from you. What is real justice? Is it punishment, or is it restoration? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and I'd love your perspective.